There is absolutely no point putting ourselves through all that we've just gone through if we're going to participate in an exercise of collective amnesia the moment the cameras move on.
Simon Still, the United Nations Climate Change Executive Secretary, making an appeal to parties and delegations at COP27 to hold each other accountable for the decisions that had just been taken. After days of intense negotiations that dragged and stretched the final session of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, for hours in the morning of the following day, a breakthrough agreement was reached on the decade-long and uncomfortable conversation to provide loss and damage funding for vulnerable countries hard hit by human-induced climate disasters. This was the thorniest issue at this COP. For years, developing countries made strong and repeated appeals for the establishment of a loss and damage fund to compensate them for the devastation ripped by climate shocks like floods, droughts, and hurricanes, for which they are the most vulnerable, whilst bearing little to no responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing it.
This
area is heavily affected by floods. Our drainage system gets blocked and filled with water. One time my kids were playing outside and one of them almost died when she fell in the flooded ditch. Fortunately, some people were around who pulled her out and performed first aid on her. Sometimes we can't leave the house to get food because of the flooded water around the house.
The principles of climate justice state that countries which have benefited from the emissions in the form of ongoing economic development and have increased wealth have an ethical obligation to share those benefits with countries which are suffering from the effects of those emissions. The interconnected food, nature, and climate crisis are right now affecting us all, but the frontline communities like mine are hardest hit. How many alarm bells need to be sounded before we act? Asks Elizabeth Wathuti, Kenyan environmentalist and founder of Green Generation Initiative.
This COP has taken an important step towards justice. I welcome the decision to establish a loss and damage fund and to operationalize it in the coming period. Clearly, this will not be enough, but it is a much-needed political signal to rebuild broken trust.
The agreement was to establish a funding mechanism to compensate vulnerable nations, and governments agreed to establish a transitional committee that would make recommendations on how to operationalize both the new funding arrangements and the fund at COP28. The transitional committee is still yet to demonstrate any actionable recommendations or progress on the resolution, a whole year down as we head to COP28.
The land is so dry. There's hardly any rain in this area. We depend on agriculture, but the crops we grow don't yield. As heads of families, we are facing a lot of challenges caused by the droughts, resulting in poverty because of low agricultural production. Our children are resorting to unsocial behaviors like stealing, and girls are getting married at a very young age because we can no longer afford taking them to school.
One would ask if there is really political will to implement these promises, or if this was as good as the same old empty promises on adaptation finance and the phasing out of fossil fuels. The commitment to set up a financial support structure still remains in ink and paper. Should we advocate for another committee to aid the transitional committee, or are we waiting for a whole island nation in Africa to be washed away by floods and then we act? The UN chief also emphasized the need to make good on the long-delayed promise of $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries, establishing clarity and a credible roadmap to double adaptation funds. This year, 2023, is the year of the global stocktake for the Paris Agreement, and this global stocktake is incomplete without an open evaluation of the promises made on climate finance.
When
the heavy rains come, water floods into our houses and causes breeding of mosquitoes. The flooding water also carries a lot of garbage into our compounds, which leads to our children getting sick. The water fills our gardens, destroying our crops, leaving us with no food for long periods of time. When the water floods, our children have no way of getting to their schools, which greatly affects their education.
There are questions that beg answers. Was COP15 a lie? As we demand that the resolution on the Loss and Damage Fund doesn't suffer the same fate as that of the adaptation finance, we also double down on our demand for a show of the political will and that the developed world fulfill its commitment to their promise in Copenhagen of $100 billion per year for the vulnerable developing countries. The broken promise has not only led to a distrust within the United Nations Climate Change Conference processes, but a delayed climate action in developing countries. With finance promised for adaptation not delivered, efforts to reduce emissions through decarbonization and access to fossil-free development pathways have been curtailed, and adaptation work to prepare for a warmer world have been limited. As a result, developing countries are now facing more loss and damage, which is increasingly leading to the erosion of development gains, including those intended to reduce emissions.
This well has a lot to do with our culture and background because it was started by our forefathers and ancestors. This is where they used to fetch water, and so we have tried to preserve that heritage. This is where we get the water for all our domestic use, so this well plays a vital role in our community. From the beginning, this well was very large, covering almost all this area. But because of the weather conditions, it has been reduced to a very small area compared to how it used to be, and the water keeps reducing every day. So because of the drought, we have very little water to fetch from the well. This well is very far from our homes, so walking from home to this well is a very big challenge. And as a parent, I'm always worried about my young daughters walking such a long distance to fetch water. And also, the water is not very clean, so our children drink this water. They always fall sick.
A loss and damage fund is incomplete without adaptation finance, and the delayed adaptation finance is also useless in the face of the dire humanitarian emergencies, as whole nations, economies, and communities gaze in the face of impending destruction, death, and collapse. Whole continents like Africa are already in advanced stages of a climate emergency, with the cost of disaster relief and response seemingly bigger than a whole nation's GDP. There is no climate action without adaptation finance. There is no climate action without a functioning loss and damage fund. In a declaration adopted by African heads of state and government during the Africa Climate Week, 4th to 6th September 2023 in Nairobi, Kenya, the African Union called upon the global community to keep past promises and fulfill their obligations. In the resolutions, they demand that the developed world, the global north, China and India, honor the commitment to provide $100 billion in annual climate finance as promised 14 years ago at the Copenhagen Conference. They also demand that the developed world and the United Nations Climate Change Conference swiftly operationalize the loss and damage facility agreed upon at COP27.
Flooding waters flows into our shops, destroying a lot of our goods. This affects a lot of our small businesses in this area.
Early this year, the 58th session of the subsidiary body of implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was held in Bonn, Germany, June 5th to 15th, 2023. This was the first opportunity for all parties to United Nations Climate Change Conference to meet since the COP27 resolutions, and it was meant to focus on several issues, including adaptation finance and loss and damage finance. However, the conference was marked by disagreements between parties and groups over the adoption of the official agenda. It took 2 weeks for delegates to agree on the agenda, making it clear that we're far apart on many issues. Simon Steele, Executive Secretary, United Nations Climate Change, observed, "Do we need to name and shame the different parties before we get some valid action on the promises made?"
My name is Odong Justin. I am a farmer, but our crops are not doing well. This place is no longer agriculture productive because whenever we grow crops, they don't yield to our expectations because we are being affected by the prolonged droughts that have hit our communities. Back then, we used to get enough food to feed and support our families. But now, since the seasons have changed, we are no longer able to do that. Even when the rains come, they come with strong storms that end up damaging the few crops that are surviving.
At SB 58, delegates were urged to focus on achieving convergence on key questions around design and quantum in 2023 on new collective quantified goal, which should include the use of a grant equivalent sub-goal with floors for needs-based adaptation and loss and damage finance. We demand that this and other technical discussions at SB 58 drive the global stocktake at COP28. The developing world does not need loans for climate finance, but grants. There is now global consensus that 99% of extreme weather events are caused by climate change. For this, Africa is responsible for less than 4% of the global CO2 emissions. Africa is not ready to continue handing over billions in debt, financing to the rich and polluting countries, banks and international financial institutions, which resources the continent desperately needs to deal with the worsening climate disasters, as well as invest in resilience and fossil-free transitions. Grants, not loans. Africa is done paying for a crisis it did not create. We shall not be pushed into a debt trap, paying for a crisis we did not cause. Giving loans will only drive African countries to extract fossil fuels to keep up with the debt servicing. We won't allow the global north, China and India to profit from a crisis they caused. This crisis has affected all the SDGs, like access to clean water, food and security.
Sometimes people drown when they step into deep ditches filled with water, mistaking them for being shallow. We often find dead bodies of these drowned people in this area whenever the floods subside.
Where is the climate finance to support adaptation and build resilience? Earlier this year, in June, at the new Global Funding Pact in Paris, the delegates affirmed in their resolutions that no country should ever have to choose between reducing poverty, achieving a green transition, and preserving the planet. However, the funds raised to support the global shield against climate risks in vulnerable countries remain a drop in the ocean, and our prayer is we never reach the point of too little, too late. Where are the climate-focused investments? Where is investment in resilience? No more promises and resolutions. We demand actionable and binding financial commitments and timely accountability. We demand for implementation of the loss and damage facility now. We demand the implementation of the COP27 resolutions now. There is no relevance of COP28 without the quantifiable implementation of the COP27 resolutions. COP28 in the UAE will be the first time since the Paris Agreement that governments will take stock collectively of the progress towards the agreement's goals and objectives. And the parties need to know that there is no direction of travel without adaptation finance. There is no direction of travel without a functioning loss and damage facility. We demand binding and actionable funding arrangements. There is no just transition without adaptation finance for developing countries. We demand for adequate and predictable financial support to developing countries for climate action, including setting a new collective quantified goal on climate finance for 2024. We demand to see funding arrangements at COP28 for the loss and damage facility, and we demand to see its operationalization in 2024. The global stocktake is weak without accountability for past promises, operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, and adaptation finance.